Welcome to the Mindful Healthcare Summit. My name is Parneet Pal. I'm a physician and the Chief Science Officer at Wisdom Labs. We are a San Francisco-based company solving for stress, burnout, and loneliness in the workplace using the science of mindfulness, resilience, and compassion. And I'm really delighted to be hosting this conversation today with our very special guest, Dr. Kelly McGonigal. And in our conversation today, we're going to be diving into the science of empathy and compassion, why it makes sense for those of us who work in healthcare to engage in these practices and even train them to become stronger, how they impact burnout, what do we mean by compassion fatigue, and how does moral distress play a role in our burnout. But most importantly, the focus throughout the conversation will be on practical tools, especially right now when we know a lot of us are facing a lot of challenges with COVID and many other economic and social crises. How can we engage these practices to show up a little more resilient in our lives? Dr. Kelly McGonigal is a health psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. Her work focuses on better understanding the mind-body connection. She's also a best-selling author of books like The Willpower Instinct and most recently, The Joy of Movement. And if you haven't watched her TED Talk, please do. It's one of the highest viewed TED Talks on how she helps us to make stress our friend. So thank you so much, Kelly, for being here, and welcome.
Thank you. I've really been looking forward to having this conversation.
Me too, Kelly. And so, Kelly, those of us who enter healthcare, most of us come in with this desire to help others, a desire to take care of and alleviate suffering. And so healthcare tends to self-select for a group of people who are naturally very highly empathic and compassionate. But even amongst folks who work in this industry, there seems to be a little bit of misunderstanding or a little bit of confusion. Empathy and compassion are words that are used interchangeably. And sometimes compassion is also kind of relegated to just this idea of being nice or being sweet or kind, almost being a pushover. So I thought a good place to start might be for you to just describe what do we mean by empathy, what do we mean by compassion, and how are they different?
Yeah, great place to start. And one thing I'll say is that when it comes to definitions, from my point of view, it's not like there is some, immutable law. This is what compassion is. This is what empathy is. It's simply that sometimes definitions can help us then later with discernment and skillful action. So, there may be some scientists or philosophers who would have different definitions, but very common in the world that I'm from, which is psychological science, we would think of compassion as a response to suffering that includes many aspects of our human experience. So it begins when you notice someone in pain or stress, some suffering or some problem in the world, and you become motivated to relieve it. So there's awareness, there's a motivation, and there are certain thoughts that support responding, a belief that there's something that you can do to make a difference, a belief that the one who is suffering is deserving of help. And you get those right thoughts and beliefs and mindsets in place, and then you'll have a physiology that actually supports responding to the suffering. So you'll see changes in the brain and in the body that give you energy, that balance the nervous system so that you are centered and yet also ready to engage a kind of an energy that is grounded and responsive to the moment. It also includes a whole range of emotions. It can involve emotions like your own stress and worry. Sometimes it involves emotions like anger and outrage. That's part of that motivation. Sometimes it involves sadness and fear. And importantly, when we talk about compassion, one of the things that distinguishes it from other responses we can have to suffering is that ideally compassion also includes these positive emotions, a sense of care for, concern, even love, a sense of self-efficacy, of hope. So, I believe that what I'm doing matters. I believe that this problem can be, even if not solved, that there's something I can do to alleviate some of this pain and suffering. And even a kind of a warm glow. So, for example, if you were to look at what happens in the brain as compassion unfolds, and people who will report that they're feeling really strong compassion, say, versus just sadness, about suffering that they're aware of. You see the activation of reward networks of the brain that make you feel like something good is possible, or that gives you that kind of warm glow that makes you feel like you're acting in line with your values, or you're feeling connected to something bigger than yourself. That's a really important part of compassion. And the idea is that this whole response that I mentioned that involves your brain and your body and your thoughts and your emotions, that it's this response pattern that all humans have. It's part of human nature, and it is part of how we, as a social species who are interdependent, who depend on one another, how we survive. So that's like a very big definition of compassion. And then empathy you can think of as being sort of, sometimes it's thought of as a subset of compassion. Sometimes you can think of it as a trait or state that can serve compassion, but it also is a state or trait that can actually derail compassion. And let me explain that. So empathy would include both the cognitive, being able to take another person's perspective. So I know how I'm thinking and feeling right now. Empathy would mean, can I imagine how you're thinking and feeling right now? So I know we're both in the Bay Area, and I might imagine what you're dealing with in terms of the wildfire and the air quality, and I can imagine myself in your shoes and think about that. So there's that aspect of empathy that is about being able to move beyond the limits of my own experience to try to imagine another person's lived experience. And it also involves a kind of curiosity. So I don't just imagine, but I inquire. Like I'm open to learning more, maybe something I couldn't even imagine because it's so different from my lived experience. So there's that aspect of empathy, perspective taking. And then there's also the type of empathy where it kind of feels like you get hit in the heart, where you are aware of somebody else's emotions or stress or pain, and it's like you catch it. It's like it's contagious. And so you see someone crying and you start crying, or you see someone get good news and they're ecstatic and your own heart swells with joy and you find yourself smiling. Or you're around other people who are angry and suddenly you feel filled with rage as well. And that's another aspect of empathy. And that, again, it's part of our human nature. Some people seem to be more susceptible than others. And you had the hypothesis that healthcare is full of people who are highly empathic. In my experience, many of the helping professions, people who are interested in reducing suffering and pain from whatever sort of tool set that they have, many of them often are very empathic in that they catch the feelings and pain of others. And it's because of that, they're more aware of the fact that there is suffering in the world, and they're more motivated to do something about it. So you can imagine how that could support compassion by getting your attention, by creating a motivation. But we also know that empathy can derail compassion if you start to become overwhelmed by, say, the distress that you feel that you are catching yourself. And so a lot of times when people talk about compassion as being a drain or empathy being a problem, say in a healthcare situation, it's the idea that it actually takes you away from what your real role is. That if you are overwhelmed by emotions, that it's actually very hard to do what you trained for. Or it may be you'll feel more of a burden at the end of the day because you feel like you're still carrying that pain and that suffering. And so one of the reasons why it can be useful to distinguish compassion from empathy is to start to recognize that empathy is like a necessary thing. It's very hard to have a positive experience of compassion, to be a force of compassion in the world without empathy. But if we equate the two, then you can start to see, why people are reluctant to, say, train every aspect of empathy to its fullest degree. Compassion sometimes requires actually creating a very strong container so that you are less susceptible to catching other people's distress without losing your ability to take their perspective, to imagine, to care about, and to care for.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kelly. And there's so much in there that I want to dive deeper into. And one of the things that you said that's so important, because throughout our medical education, we know from the research that empathy rates actually tend to decline as we go through medical school and as we go through residency training, which is a shame. But I think it's also sort of that protective mechanism when we don't know how to deal with those difficult emotions in a more skillful way. And then we tend to sort of just say, I can't deal with this right now. now, there's too much on my plate. So we're going to definitely dive into how we can do better with that. But could you also talk to us about, it seems that we all, as human beings, we lie on the spectrum from low to high empathy or low to high compassion. What are the different factors that might be involved in determining, where we start off before we can actually train ourselves consciously?
I mean, I can mention a few. I would say that my perspective, I really like to take a growth mindset towards compassion and empathy. In part because, that's like the work of the last 10 years that I've spent with compassion is helping people strengthen their compassion. And by strengthening, that can mean if you start off with sort of, so some people have a more narrow circle of compassion. It's really easy to have empathy for family, friends, people who seem like me. And it's just everyone else. It's harder to take their perspective or to feel the strong motivation. And so in that case, strengthening compassion means getting the circle bigger, increasing your capacity to imagine, increasing your circle of concern. But, for me, I will have to say, because of my own orientation, like more the hyper empathic, extreme sensitivity. And I always like to say, like, one of the greatest joys of my life is actually difficult empathy. So, people are drawn to literature and works of art. I love the experience of having true empathy for people for whom it's supposed to be difficult to feel empathy for. So if you're on that side of the spectrum, like I am, strengthening compassion really means strengthening your capacity to feel and not get overwhelmed, strengthening your capacity to open to discomfort, to maybe let go of some protective barriers that people put in place to try not to be overwhelmed by the needs of others or feel taken advantage of by the needs of others. So there's like different ways of thinking about a growth mindset towards compassion and empathy. And then life experiences can very dramatically shape the degree to which your natural instinct gets expressed. So, one example, early life experiences. We know that people who have strong positive relationships with a caregiver or other adults in their lives are more likely to have a natural development of the compassionate instinct and empathy for others. Whereas if your primary relationships with people who are supposed to care for you, if those relationships are troubled, if you experience neglect or abuse or trauma or even sometimes loss, the protective mechanism can be to shut down that empathic instinct, because we actually know like it's more important to be the recipient of other people's empathy and compassion for your own development than it is to say be told by adults somewhere it's so important to be compassionate. You have to receive it from others to feel a certain sense of security or care, and to be valued by others for your own, whatever your temperament is, for it to flourish most fully. Yeah, I don't know if that spoke to, but again, like I'm not so that interested in like temperament and personality, because we're here to meet people where they are. So, and there are strengths to every temperament. The person who can intellectually understand this person is in pain and yet isn't that overwhelmed by it could be a really good surgeon. There are a lot of ways to relieve suffering in the world. And I don't think that strength and compassion is always about trying to like maximize every feeling, every thought, and every capability. A lot of this is about figuring out what your own compassionate instincts are and how to harness them.
I love it. I love this because I think it's a bit of a relief, it's just like, oh, okay, good. Like this is not like another target that I have to reach and sort of my 20-point, to-do list for the day and life goals. And that.
Although I will say actually, so looking at some of the research, I know you're interested in practical skills, and I always feel like research is super practical. So there's research looking at different aspects of empathy and how they relate to satisfaction in healthcare professionals. And there are three main sort of categories of empathy. One is empathic concern. And that is simply that when you see someone in pain or suffering, you want them to not be suffering. And I think for a lot of healthcare professionals, that's pretty locked in. Although it is one of the things, as you mentioned, that can deteriorate over a professional career. So higher levels of empathic concern consistently associated with higher levels of professional satisfaction, higher levels of compassion satisfaction, which is really about feeling like you're making a difference, and enjoying your role, and lower levels of burnout. So that type of empathy is a protective factor. We also know that empathic distress has the opposite relationship. So to the degree that you are more likely to feel like you catch the pain or the suffering of others, and you actually are carrying it, that at the end of the day you report feeling drained or distressed, that increases your risk of burnout. And it's one of the reasons why people start to try to dial down their empathy. But we also know that, so there's that other type, the ability to take the perspective of others, that other aspect of empathy, that is actually related to increased levels of empathic joy and empathic relief. So, interesting study where physicians are treating a patient with pain, and to the degree that physician has a stronger tendency to take the perspective of their patients, the more you see activation of the reward system of the brain when they are treating that patient for pain. That is, that you don't only share in the distress, but you can actually take more of that vicarious joy, that compassion, satisfaction. So when people try to tamp down their empathy, or it happens as just a spontaneous protective response, that somehow the brain and body figure out, if at the end of the day I feel like I need to get drunk to undo all the stress that I'm carrying from being around a lot of people who are scared and in pain, not to mention the stress of your colleagues in the system. If you're at that point, your brain and body might be like, it would be healthier just not to feel any of this. One of the reasons that increases the risk of burnout is because it also reduces your ability to experience contagious joy and contagious relief and compassion, satisfaction. So it's why it's so important to find a way to do empathy that works for you, and to actually practice the version of empathy that is about empathic joy or empathic relief.
Kelly, I'm reminded of this video. I don't know if you saw this a couple of years ago. It went viral on YouTube by the Cleveland Clinic, and it was all about empathy as one of their values. And it was this really touching and poignant look at the backstories of all the people that you might encounter as you walk through a hospital. And it really, really moving. So it really was highlighting for example, the agony of a patient who might be waiting for a difficult diagnosis or a test result, or the sadness of a family member who has a loved one on life support. But on the flip side, it was also sort of revealing the stories of the healthcare providers. As they are treating others, this might be a cancer survivor on their own, or they might be at the end of a 12-hour long grueling shift. And sort of the end of the video said, if you could see what they see and if you could hear what they hear, would you treat them differently? And so I think, when for healthcare providers, I think, intuitively, of course, we understand that the relationship between, patient and provider is really important. As you mentioned, there's a lot of good research now showing those beneficial effects. So you alluded to a few of those benefits already. Could you dive a little bit deeper into, for the healthcare providers, in addition to sort of the satisfaction of knowing that they've done a good job, what are the other benefits to the healthcare system, but also to the patients in terms of their health outcomes and recovery?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There are, a bunch of small studies looking at the benefits for patient outcomes when a physician is experiencing more empathy, or is expressing aspects of compassion, everything from greater pain relief to, greater healing from various illnesses. And I think that, one thing that I'll point out is that when you look at what patients are encoding as compassion, it can be different than sometimes what healthcare providers think compassion looks like. So, and again, this requires sometimes like taking the perspective of the patient or the loved one. I remember one study, and this was something that one of the strongest expressions of compassion as it was received by family members or patients is hope, having hope in almost any circumstance. That was received as an act of compassion. Also, things that bring genuine positive emotions into the interaction. Empathy and compassion isn't always crying when your patient is crying. Sometimes, and you'll hear from patients sometimes that it meant a lot when I was just realizing what this diagnosis meant, and I saw that my physician or my nurse was also moved to tears. You'll hear stories like that about that being perhaps an important moment. When you look more consistently at the data, it can be things like smiling. It's things like eye contact. It's things like friendly touch, or asking about a person's life outside of the diagnosis or their illness, showing interest in that person as a human being, things that allow us to experience positive emotions of connection and care, and sort of whatever feels like the appropriate form of love in your interaction with that patient. I think that's an important thing to remember. So because then you can start to see how that would have benefits for the physician as well. If you think that compassion has to be crying with your patient or expressing sympathy, I'm so sorry for your loss. If it's only the heavy stuff, which often is not what's most received as compassion in the moment, then it becomes less clear what's the benefit to the physician, because it starts to feel again like a burden that you're carrying or a distress that you are only sharing. But when you realize that compassion, the way it's expressed in difficult moments, is often through positive social interactions, you start to see how the caregiver, the healthcare provider, becomes a recipient of their own compassion as well, because it's those moments of connection that are often a resource when things go wrong. And one thing that I wanted to mention as a point of view that I think is underappreciated. So, you're talking about the benefits of things like compassion, empathy, mindfulness as a practice. And one thing that I have been trying to get people to reflect on is that times like this, or anytime you're working in a situation with high stakes and imperfect resources, which is, I think, healthcare in a lot of scenarios, not only a public health crisis, is that you are going to be forming memories that will haunt you. And I've met a lot of people who are in various helping professions, first responders, law enforcement, military rescue. They all have memories that will haunt them to the end of their lives. And they happen without mindfulness. We don't sit there and think, I want to remember this moment of tragedy or this moment where I failed to save a life. We don't have to think about that. That just gets forged in our nervous system. We're also making memories that can sustain us. We are at the same time making memories that reinforce our value, that reinforce what's good in our community. And for whatever reason, those memories don't seem to be forged in steel as spontaneously as the memories that haunt us. So one of the resources that I'm encouraging people to think about is, how do you make the memories that will sustain you? How do you, in your mind, take in that moment of connection? Or if somebody expresses gratitude to you, how do you take it in so it becomes a story that will replay, a scene you remember? When you have a moment of mutual cooperation with a colleague, that positive collegial memory, when a team came together, how do you make a story out of that you can turn to when you need an antidote to sorry, my cats. Anyone here who has cats know the cats are a lot like emotions. The more you try to manipulate them, the worse the situation is for you. So we'll let the cats be like thoughts going through your mind in meditation. Just let them go and not get pulled into it.
So I love so much about what you said about really taking the time to savor the memories and the interactions, the meaningful interactions that we have, as sort of, it's almost like this bank that you can rely on in times of challenge. And I think,
and there's a practice you probably know. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just thinking I forgot to say something super practical.
Yes, please. We're all for practical here. Yeah.
I'll give you the super practical then, because I know you're going to know this practice because of your familiarity with positive psychology and contemplative practices. And maybe people have heard this. There's this practice that's been well studied called 3 good things, where at the end of the day, you're supposed to think about, or even better yet, share with someone else in your life 3 good things that happened that day. And there's research that this makes you happier and it improves all sorts of wonderful things. But I like to dial this down in very intense moments. 3 is a lot. That sometimes is a challenge. And we also know from research that if you think like, I have to list 10 things I'm grateful for, and you get to 7 and it's hard to come up with 8, like the whole exercise can backfire. So I like to lower the stakes and make the practice one good thing. And when I wake up in the morning, ever since shelter in place started for us 6 months ago, and a lot about my ability to serve my community changed. I started setting the intention, today I'm going to do one good thing to make someone else's life better, and one thing to try to make my own life better, which includes like my household and my near community. And then I look for that opportunity all day long. So when it happens, I can encode it, that I realize I'm making a choice. If this is that moment where I was able to make someone else's life better today, and then I try to remember it at the end of the day. So that's a really practical exercise. And again, because I'm a psychologist, to me, it's obvious the benefits of choosing where you place your attention. But if, for someone who's listening now, who's like, how does, I don't know, that seems really lightweight or simplistic. But the truth is that we know that when you set an intention to pay attention to something, that it actually begins to change how you interact with the world, what you remember, how you remember things, how other people perceive you. There's something very powerful about having that intention that you come back to again and again. It's one of the definitions of mindfulness. So that's a practical tool, I'll say, is the one good thing. And if you forget to set the intention, you can still do it at the end of whatever your day is, in the shower or going to bed, and to not just name it, but to try to replay it and savor it so that you're starting to build that strength of memory that becomes a source of resilience.
Beautiful, fantastic. For me, one of the things that was really helpful when going through the research around, outcomes and the patient interactions with empathy and compassion was also remembering that from a very practical standpoint, because I know a lot of physicians can think this way sometimes, and healthcare administrators can be of this mindset, is that it actually makes for effective cost of care, because patient satisfaction ratings go up when empathy levels go up amongst physicians. And physicians, when they build that meaningful connection that you so beautifully pointed out, asking a patient, really caring about the entire life of the patient beyond sort of their diagnosis or illness, and seeing them as a complete human being, that really impacts the number of diagnostics tests that you will ask for, or the number of specialist referrals that you will make. And so it's really interesting to note how the interconnection and how far the depth of that connection can go in healthcare. And of course, for patients, it's been it's really interesting to note that, wow, blood sugar levels can come down quicker. The immune function improves. They need fewer pain medications, and all because their physician or nurse or other provider took the time to just treat them as a whole human being.
And again, this would not surprise any developmental psychologist. I mentioned, when does compassion flourish? When you feel cared for and when you feel safe and seen and loved. I mean, everything about the human physiology it functions best when you feel cared for. So it's neat. Oh, insulin levels, that's neat. Of course it's neat, but of course it should also be totally obvious that human beings function best when we feel cared for, when we feel seen, valued, and so it's almost like, what could you measure where you wouldn't see it if you're going to compare it to the way that sort of worst case situations in healthcare, people feel isolated and often dehumanized, not through the intention of healthcare providers, but because of the system. Which actually brings me to something I know we were going to talk about, the system. Because it's not just the patients who can feel dehumanized, it's also everyone working in the system who can feel dehumanized by various aspects of the system. And one of the things when we were chatting before this, you and I were talking about compassion fatigue, and I have a different perspective on it than a lot of people who work in this area, in that I think It's obviously real. It is not just empathy fatigue. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because my concern is that when people focus on labeling empathic distress as something that is fatiguing, like that, okay, that's true. And compassion, as we've talked about it, is less exhausting and fatiguing than empathic distress, where all you're feeling is the overwhelm. Okay, that's an important distinction to make. But too often people then say, so you can never be fatigued by compassion or through compassion because, compassion is somehow pure or positive or self-sustaining and nurturing. And so if you could just do compassion right, you would never get to the point of burnout. You would never experience exhaustion or overwhelm. And I find that problematic because it doesn't make any sense when you understand compassion as a response system that requires certain things to allow that response system to function sustainably, which is the belief that there's something you can do that makes a difference, the being fueled and having your own energy, you yourself feeling safe and supported, having models of compassion and helping, effective compassion and helping in your environment. There's so much that supports your individual ability to channel compassion and to act with compassion that is about your environment, and it's about the system that you're in, and it's about the moment you're meeting. And so I think it's really important to talk about compassion fatigue as something that can happen to people who are really good at compassion, and even those who have figured out the empathic distress part, and they're great at managing their emotions and they're mindful about their distress. You can still get to compassion fatigue if the amount of suffering that you're confronting is actually larger than you can relieve, which is true for a lot of people in different moments in their career. The suffering is actually too much, and you will fail to relieve a lot of that suffering. When you're in a system where you feel like, rather than it enabling you to have the best response, you feel like there are aspects of the system that are disrupting your ability to provide the best care. When you yourself don't feel supported. There's all this research looking at compassion fatigue, and one of the biggest predictors of it is your relationship with your coworkers. Do you have supportive relationships with your colleagues? How do you feel about your management? And if compassion fatigue were only about empathy fatigue, that wouldn't make a lot of sense. Why would you need to have friends at work? Like, why would you need to feel that your workplace values and supports you? And so I wanted to put that forward because compassion is not a do-it-yourself project. It's not that every healthcare provider needs to find a way to be compassionate and that solves everything. That there's a lot about the system that can be changed and supported and brought closer to an ideal. And also, there are going to be moments in any professional's career where the scale of suffering is so big and your ability to respond is so limited that you can expect to have to deal with feelings of compassion fatigue or moral distress or moral residue. And that's not a failure of you as a compassionate being or healthcare provider.
So this is really powerful and important, what you just said, because, it was certainly true in my understanding when I was sort of under, felt this pressure that I just have to tap into this never-ending infinity pool of compassion, and that I was doing it wrong if I was feeling fatigued or burdened by my difficult emotions. And I think, just when we look at the rates of burnout across healthcare right now, and of course with COVID, everything is just sort of taken to a whole other level. I also sense this kind of pushback amongst colleagues. If I mention something around, resilience training programs or compassion training programs, and the response very justifiably is that, wait a second, we are some of the grittiest, most resilient people on the planet, and we are some of the most compassionate. So don't tell me to do this again. So I think that really helps clarify for folks who might be listening in and feeling that way.
And this is where it's yes and. I get this too because all the work that I do, this is the great challenge of meeting the present moment, which is we need to stand up for things that actually relieve suffering or that give you the tools to relieve suffering, that aren't about, okay, I'm just going to learn to deal with this loss more effectively or deal with my setback more effectively. Like, the example would be like PPE. You need it. Don't give me a meditation about how it's okay that I don't have it. Just get it to me. We need that. That is compassion in action, right? To actually relieve suffering when it can be done, provide the care that is possible. And then what do we do in that moment when we're in what Parker Palmer calls the tragic gap? So we have these ideals, we have these motivations, and we are in an actual moment of reality right now that is painful because our capacity to live those ideals is being limited, or because we see things happening that hurt our heart, that go against our values and ideals, and maybe even we feel like we're a part of that sometimes. So I think, one of the reasons why I so value practices of mindfulness and compassion training and contemplative practices is I'm a realist, I'm a pragmatist. So we need skills like this because there are going to be a lot of moments where you're in the tragic gap. But I absolutely understand how infuriating it can be when it feels like all you're getting is being told to like micromanage your inner experience, when so much of this is about also managing circumstances for those people who have the power and the resources to do it. So I totally get why there can be resistance to this. And also, this is the moment that's happening. And I can say with relative confidence that if you learn some mindfulness practices, however horrible the moment is, you are going to be able to move through it and move forward better for yourself, for the role that you care about, and the community you care about.
And I know that we're gonna, you're going to lead us through a practice at the end of this conversation. But before we get there, you've already highlighted many different practical strategies and tools that we can bring online. And I wanted to also present sort of just building on a common scenario and just getting your thoughts on, what on the spot, how can somebody in this situation manage this better? So, in the ICU, there's a patient who's been diagnosed with COVID, is on life support. The prognosis is not looking good. Their family members justifiably really upset. And you're in the position of being part of the healthcare team. You're dealing with all of these PPE and other, resource shortages on the side. You haven't eaten for hours. In that moment when you have to go and have that, very important conversation with this family member, tell us, Kelly, how can we approach that in a way that serves both the family member and your own well-being?
Yeah. So the way that I think about this, it's going to be very similar to what you're going to hear from other people in this series. These are some things that I've heard and learned from people like Kristen Neff and Joan Halifax. My first thought in a situation like that, and I find myself in different versions of that, being not a healthcare provider, but my first instinct is to acknowledge that this is a moment of suffering. And what I often add to it is, this is a moment that matters. This comes from my work on stress. So this is a moment of suffering is really important to acknowledge for yourself, for others, for everyone in this circumstance. This is a moment that matters is a mindset that helps activate the part of your brain that is looking for hope and is looking for that approach motivation that allows you to avoid collapse or despair. So thinking about those, this is a moment of suffering and this is a moment that matters. And it matters because you're in it and there's something that you can do or choose or say to relieve that suffering. So that's the first part. It takes a lot less time than what I took to explain it. And then to shrink your focus to what is actually unfolding in the present moment with that intention to do something to relieve the suffering. And in moments like this where the suffering is so big, often it requires really shrinking your focus with the intention to deliver the care that is possible or relieve the suffering that is in your sphere of influence that will allow you in that moment to have some wisdom about what to do or say. But you don't actually know. I don't know. Depending on who that family member is, they might need to hear something different or to be met in a different way. Some people need silence. Some people need words. Some people need... in the moment, I think having that intention and paying attention allows the most natural and skillful response to emerge, and will allow you to adapt based on how that person responds. And the thing that, so I mentioned Krista Neff is someone who has a lot of these great on the moment practices. Something I heard her say years ago that has really stuck with me is the phrase, I alone am not the cause of the suffering, and I alone will not be the solution to it. I think that that's how it landed in my brain, and I've sort of lived with that for years. And I think that that also is an important framework to have when you are transitioning out of such an interaction, that it's a way of sort of putting down the burden and being able to meet the next moment that matters and play your role in that moment. Now, another thing that I would do, which is the practice I'll lead you in, is something called heart breathing. So I will, we can talk about that. But, another on-the-spot practice that I will often use is the Just Like Me practice, which is something we talk about a lot in compassion and empathy training, that if you find yourself being triggered by other people's difficult behaviors, when a patient is, people know what I'm talking about, that the language that we use, that to in that moment look at them and say to yourself, just like me, this person wants to be happy, healthy, and free from suffering. It is a level of empathy that, first of all, is guaranteed to be true because they're human. And in that moment, it can allow you to soften any resistance that's building, any irritation that's building about the moment or the person you're interacting with. It also can help you connect if it's not even that it feels difficult, but that it's just another and another, and you're having a challenge, feeling like you're bringing your full presence. That is a phrase that can really be helpful. Just like me, this person wants to be happy, healthy, and free from suffering. And I believe that the most skillful, compassionate responses emerge from just connecting to humanity in that way, rather than having like the checklist of things you need to do and say.
I love that, because I think it really points to the fact that at the end of the day, it's all about that authentic connection. I mean, you can't tool your way or strategize your way out of these situations, and you really have to connect with your own fallibility, and take stock of the situation and just sort of be vulnerable as well with the folks that you're interacting with.
And here's the thing, right, is you can treat it like an experiment. I mean, you don't have to take our word for it. Try it. I am always encouraging people, no matter what the strategy is that I'm recommending, that in theory is, grounded in science and wisdom. You are an individual and you can find your own way through this. So treat it like an experiment. Put yourself in the treatment group. See what happens if you use that phrase before you interact with a family member or with a patient. See if it changes how you feel when you walk out of the room. See if it changes the residue that you're left with at the end of a shift. Leave behind the stuff that is not supporting your ability to show up in this role in the way that you want to.
We are going to get to the practice in a second, but we've been talking about mindfulness and compassion practices and empathy practices, but what else can we add to our repertoire outside of these practices to build our resilience? And can you talk a little bit about even the reframing of stress that you have so beautifully talked about before, and how that might change, or any other things that come to mind?
Well, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind is exercise, because there's nothing else. I've done a lot of teaching about how to strengthen your ability to, deal with difficult things in life. And when people say, what's the number one thing to do? I don't say meditation. I say exercise. Absolutely number one. Whatever you can do in the body that you have. It's not about having to lose weight or having to, do a certain specific type of activity. It's the body you have, using your body to mobilize muscles, increase your heart rate, breathe a little bit more deeply, and experience yourself as engaged in life through your body. Nothing you can do that is going to produce more chemicals from your muscles and from your brain in your bloodstream, affecting every system of your body, than exercise. It's like a miracle. The research is coming out now about how exercise affects dozens and hundreds of chemicals and proteins that affect everything from, blood sugar to brain health, to heart health, to immune function. You can't do anything. You cannot choose anything else that is more likely to lead to physical resilience, brain resilience, psychological resilience. So it just has to be a priority. And I tell people, look, if you had time to sleep, I know you don't have a lot of time to sleep, but most people are sleeping at least, to some degree, and you're eating. Exercise is as important as that, and it just needs to be, you don't eat on the weekends when you think about it, you eat every day. Movement is the same way. And in terms of reframing stress, there's a lot to that, but the takeaway that I often am encouraging people is to stop imagining there is an alternate version of this moment that is less stressful because you managed to do something right or life was more fair. There's this idea, because we've so often been taught that stress is unhealthy and bad, that somehow that got paired with the belief that you can avoid stress. And a lot of people clung to that. I actually feel like until this year, when so much has collapsed around the world, that a lot of people are like, oh, wait, that bubble bath just is not getting rid of the pandemic and climate crisis and everything else. So maybe I can't focus on avoiding and reducing stress. And that's the main reset is, okay, you meet reality where it is and start to think about what human strengths do I have and what resources do I have in my community that allow me to meet this moment. And that's the thing that's really interesting, is that compassion is one of them, by the way. Compassion is actually a human strength that is created or designed or evolved to help you meet stress in a way that is good for you and good for others. And there are lots of other ones too, but I think that's another webinar.
Yes, indeed. So as we wrap up this conversation, Kelly, please do lead us through a short practice on compassion. But I think, for everyone who's listening in, I just want to say I hope this has been a very useful conversation. I know we've gone through so many on-the-spot tools and strategies that we can use, but I hopefully just a different mindset around how we are thinking of these interactions with our colleagues and our patients and ourselves as we go through this challenge. So thank you so much, Kelly, and looking forward to this meditation.
Yeah, and let me also say, if you heard something that's useful, write it down and stick it somewhere you're going to see it again, because there's so much information that you are getting and so much wisdom you'll be hearing. If you like that, that idea just like me, write it down. If you like that idea, this is a moment of suffering, this is a moment that matters, like write it down right now and just put it somewhere. Write it on your hand. So the practice, I'm going to describe it. I'll lead you through it. It's not a fancy practice, right? So this is not formal meditation. Get your hands in a mudra, close your eyes. This is on the spot. And in my experience, this is a practice that is really supportive when you need to tap into your compassionate strength, your compassionate resolve and reserve. So let me tell you what it is, and then I'll teach you how to do it. It's an idea, it's a visualization that you could breathe in and out of your physical heart. Now, you've got a great working model of the anatomy here. I don't need you to get it too complicated, but to just like how the feeling of it would be. Like, what if your nostrils weren't on your face and they were actually on your chest, and somehow the airflow went right into your heart? Don't make this too anatomically detailed, just the idea of it. Inhaling into your heart, exhaling out of your heart. It's a visualization that creates often a feeling state and a change in your autonomic nervous system activation that is balancing, that produces a grounding, a centering, while staying ready to act. It's, Joan Halifax sometimes talks about the embodiment of compassion as being a readiness to respond. And you can see that in the autonomic nervous system. You can see that in how your heart is functioning. So for whatever reason, the imagery of breathing in and out of your heart while taking relatively patient deep breaths, but it doesn't have to be like a complicated endeavor, it shifts you into that state. It increases heart rate variability. It increases the parasympathetic sympathetic balance that allows you to then engage with the world from a place of being centered and also connected to your compassionate motivation. And one thing that I'll say is I found in speaking to some other communities, people were confused about this. They thought it was a heart opening practice, that like somehow breathing in and out of the heart was meant to make you more vulnerable and sensitive. No, this is how to think about it. It's a heart strengthening practice. It's a heart nourishing practice, a heart fueling practice, or even a clearing away. So when your heart feels heavy, you could imagine breathing in and out of your heart as a way of lightening some of what you're carrying in your heart, in your physiology, in your mind. So that's the intention of the practice. I've already been talking about it way longer than the practice actually is. So let's try it on. And then when you would use this is anytime you want to connect to your compassionate strength or your compassionate motivation. So feel free to close your eyes if you'd like. Nothing interesting is going to be happening visually over here. Or just drop your gaze a bit and notice that you're already breathing, right? So that is the first step. You notice that you are already breathing, right? You're already connected to something that sustains you, that fuels you. Don't worry about over controlling your breath. Just breathe. Let yourself be breathed. And then you imagine that your nostrils are on your chest, or somehow your heart has a connection to the world around you. And you can just breathe into your heart. Maybe sense the heart expand as the lungs expand. And then imagine breathing out through your heart. Again, any way that makes sense to you, that gives you a feeling. You can actually feel the physical expansion of your lungs on either side of your heart. Right? You can actually feel that. And so you might focus on the quality of that whole area expanding as you breathe in. And that whole area, that expansion dissolving as you breathe out. Can you feel that expansion around the physical lungs as you breathe in? It can be kind of subtle. And that expansion dissolving as you breathe out of your heart. And as an option, as you're doing this imagery of breathing in and out of the heart, you could imagine breathing in whatever it is that you need to meet this moment. So you could imagine breathing in connection to your values. You could imagine breathing in the support of a mentor. You could imagine breathing in the last time somebody thanked you for the care that you provide. Anything that feels like a resource, you could imagine breathing it in, carrying that with you. And you can also imagine, if it feels more appropriate, the breathing out. So if there's something that you're carrying that you want to put down in order to be more effective in your next interaction, or in order to go home and interact with your family, you could imagine breathing out, breathing into the heart, and just breathing out whatever it is that you don't need to carry forward. That's the practice. And again, 3 breaths can be sufficient to change your physiology and to change your mindset.
Thank you, Kelly. It was astonishing because I was breathing in the support of my brother, who I kind of look up to and is always a pillar of strength for me. And it was really interesting just to note the literal shift in my body as I breathed that in. And I really felt that kind of heart strengthening that you were mentioning.
I love that idea. I said it once before, compassion isn't do it yourself. There is something really valuable about finding ways to take strength from others, whether it's people who care about you, people who have come before you, even people who have suffered can be a source of strength. And to think about sometimes I even imagine like their hands on my back and sort of supporting me into a situation that I'm encountering. So thank you for sharing that example. That was really beautiful.
Thank you. Kelly, I wish I could keep talking to you. I'm just bowled over by your brilliance and really by your compassion and kindness. and your enthusiasm to share all these ideas in a way that's really that lands really well. So I hope for everyone who's listening to this conversation that this has been useful for you. We encourage you to engage in these practices and hopefully feel all of our hands on your back as you move out into the world in this time of challenge. Thank you so much, and thank you again, Kelly, for your wisdom and your time. Take good care.